If you have your Bible this morning and you want to turn to Genesis chapter 16, that's where we're going to be reading this morning, Genesis chapter 16. We've been studying really the life of Abraham, but if you'll notice as we read this morning, he's not even Abraham yet. He's still going by the name Abram. We're following the story of how God works in his life, but as we've mentioned before, one of the things we want to make most clear as we study this time through the book of Genesis, we're making it clear that this is not really just the story of Abram, but the story of God, and the fact that God pursues a relationship with Abram. Last week specifically, we were looking at Genesis chapter 15, and we saw for the first time the use of the word covenant as it relates to God's relationship with Abram. And more importantly, if you have your Bible open already, you can look at Genesis chapter 15, verse 6 from last week. We saw what is one of the most significant verses in this whole account of Abram's life, the fact that Abram believed God and God counted it to him as righteousness. And the New Testament makes it very clear for us that this is the definition of faith over works, that believing in God's justifying and saving power is what brought Abram into this special relationship with God. That's why we can call him the father of those who have faith. In that sense, Abram is our spiritual father. As is often the case in the Old Testament, if you're familiar with reading there, you're going to recognize this, that we often find the idea of faith being defined positively, and then immediately after, almost as a way of teaching us, God allows us to see faith defined negatively. And I'm sorry to say, but that's what we're going to be seeing this morning in Genesis chapter 16. And if you have your Bible and you want to follow along with me, you can follow with me Genesis 16, starting in verse 1. The Bible says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, 'Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her.' And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram her husband as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, 'May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me.' But Abram said to Sarai, 'Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please.' Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, 'Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?' And she said, 'I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai.' The angel of the Lord said to her, 'Return to your mistress and submit to her.' The angel of the Lord also said to her, 'I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude.' And the angel of the Lord said to her, 'Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen.' So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, 'You are a God of seeing.' For she said, 'Truly here I have seen him who looks after me.' Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram." Now, you cannot find any more perfectly defined a love triangle in any TV show that you would watch than you would in this passage. We recognize there's a triangle of relationships in this chapter, and it introduces a new storyline, a storyline of grief for Abram, for Sarai, for Hagar, and really for their descendants throughout history. But first, we should not be surprised to see that immediately after God condescended to meet Abram in the ceremony of covenant that we talked about last week in Genesis 15, Abram's faith is tested, and with not so positive results. That the opposite we see of faith, which we saw defined last week in chapter 15, is sin, and that this is always a slander against God himself. the Bible begins this chapter by saying, okay, now. And remember, the chapter numbers in the Bible were added by us to help us find where things are at in the Bible. So that's not the way that Moses wrote it when he was writing the book of Genesis. We put the chapter numbers and the verse numbers in there so we could find things easily. So when you see something like the word now, for us, that seems very natural because it comes right after the number 16, and we say, okay, that's a great way to start a chapter. But if you were reading the story straight on through, remember that the very last thing that happened is that God made a covenant with Abram. It was this amazing experience, right, where God condescended to come down to Abram and do a covenant ceremony just like the kings of his day would have done. Abram was in a deep sleep, and God spoke to him words of promise. You will surely have a son. Your descendants will surely inherit this land. And then we say now, right after that event, is when Sarai's plan is hatched. And this isn't, by the way, only Sarai's problem. Abram consents to her plan, and you have to keep that in mind throughout this whole event. Certainly it is Sarai saying, I'm going to put this forward, but Abram never stops it, never stands in the way. And it occurs immediately after this ceremony. And it's repeated again, that even Sarai says again in verse 2, behold, now the Lord has prevented me. We're introduced to this servant of hers, Hagar, and Hagar, of course, is the tragic figure in the story. She's not consulted in this matter. She's a slave. She's a servant of Sarai. She doesn't have a choice. The Bible tells us this about her, that she's Egyptian, which means that she may have been a part of the increase of wealth that Abram and Sarai accumulated to themselves when they had been in Egypt some years before this. You remember that, and how we talked about that was, in a sense, some of the early, immature, faithless actions of Abram, that he fled the land of promise that God had given to him because there was a famine in the land, went down to Egypt and found all kind of trouble here. And one of the things that came back with him was a servant for Sarai. This is probably when Hagar was acquired, although we don't know that for sure. We will discuss the impact of this situation a little bit more for her in the second half of this passage, so I'm kind of skipping over that for now, but I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring that. I don't want you to think that this is only about Sarai and Abraham, but we're going to come back to Hagar because she has some special information at the end of this passage. But I want you to notice, for at least now, Sarai's reasoning, and Abram doesn't refute this. She actually says, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So catch that. Sarai says, okay, I know God has promised you that you're going to have a son, and that's actually what he just confirmed in the ceremony of the covenant, but the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. A couple of things to recognize about that. First of all, I heard a preacher on the radio many years ago. I would credit him if I can remember his name, and I'm not going to, but it wasn't my thought. But he pointed out, he said the Old Testament is 100% consistent that God causes conception. And after he said that, I went and looked it up, and this is absolutely, whether in positive or negative stories, it is always consistent that God is in control of conception. It's a great picture from the Old Testament. It's an absolute sure teaching, and that is something that Sarai is saying here. Sarai is saying, because I am not able to have children, this is of the Lord. He is the one who's in control of conception. In the sense of God's sovereignty, she is correct about that. However, you and I also know that that's not just a factual statement for her, right? She's not just stating that that is a truth. She's stating that as an accusation, right? She's saying that God does not intend to keep his promise the way he said he would. In other words, Sarai knew that God had prevented her from becoming pregnant before this. She, at this point, is quite elderly, right? Remember, Abram was 75 when they began this journey, and she's roughly 10 years younger than him. So she's known that this is the case for a long time. Why does it suddenly become? It's not just a recognition that God's in control of this. It's also an accusation. I'm tired of waiting. God is not going to keep his promise that way. I want to take just a moment and point something out, and we could spend more time on this, but this is often a question when reading the Old Testament. It can be a contest to the validity of the Old Testament. It's not an unfair one, but it is one that I think we can set straight pretty quickly. There's no indication in the Old Testament that polygamy, having multiple wives, is accepted by God as morally right. We see it occurring in the Old Testament often. We see it occurring even with people who are going to be used as an example of faithfulness in other areas of their life, like we're going to see in this story. But that doesn't mean that God condones it or that God puts his stamp of approval on it, whether it's in Abram's life, whether it's in King David's life. We do see those things. We see that God recognizes that person for faithfulness in other areas of their life, but he never condones what they've done with polygamy or taking multiple wives. The pattern from creation was one man and one woman, and Jesus himself was very clear that he used that example from the book of Genesis to say that God created a man and woman to become one flesh, that should not be something that any man should tear apart. And I say that just to make it clear that this is something that Abram and Sarai knew as well. That's why Sarai has to hatch this plan. It's an unusual plan. It would be tempting to say, well, it was a different age, it was a different time, and this sort of thing was accepted at the time. That may be somewhat culturally true, but it was not true that Abram and Sarai thought this was morally right. It's not the case. They both knew that that was not something that God had intended from the beginning. This was a moral runaround of the way God was ruling their lives so far. Both Abram and Sarai were not ignorant that this was a man-centered abandonment of God's plan. And that's the way we're supposed to see it in Scripture. I'm not saying that with the judgmentalness of that we don't have any sin today. We're just recognizing that they didn't get some sort of pass because they lived a long time before we did. They knew that that was God's intent from the beginning of creation. This is not to make their sin worse than ours, only to point out that God is a revelatory and saving God. And the basis of our sinfulness is actually in a failing of faith. And this is a really key point. Again, I want you to know this just about the Old Testament. It may help you if you're new to that and still trying to follow why we have these stories coming at us in the Old Testament, why there's these stories of horrible things happening and good things happening, what's going on. That if God were a perfect teacher, he could not make a better lesson, just like a teacher you would have in school that would give you both a positive and a negative example. And Genesis 15 and 16 are exactly that way. We have a positive example. This is exactly what saving faith is. Abram believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And here we see a perfect definition of the origin of sin in our lives, and that is that it is faithlessness on our part. It is a failing of faith. The New Testament makes this point. We won't belabor it, but Romans 14, Paul says clearly, whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. That's an interesting thought, that you thought sin was what wicked people thought up in the quietness of their hearts when they were laying in bed and they thought, tomorrow I want to do something bad to someone. I want to murder someone. I want to beat somebody up. I want to take their money. Certainly we know that kind of thing that exists, but Paul says actually whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. The basis of sin is faithlessness in our life. The author of Hebrews says the same thing. He says it's without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Won't spend a lot of time on that verse. It's a powerful verse. And by the way, the author of Hebrews then goes on to talk quite extensively about Abram himself, using him as an example of faith in the positive sense, just as we did in Genesis 15, but here we see a negative sense for he and Sarai. Doesn't Sarai's accusation against God sound similar to passing the blame? Any parent should recognize it. If you've been studying the Old Testament, you should recognize it as well. From the very first introduction of sin, what do we find, right? God comes and he confronts Adam and Eve, and he says, Adam, what's going on? And Adam says, the woman who you gave me, right? She took the fruit of the tree and she gave it to me. And he says, Eve, what's going on? And Eve says, well, the serpent, and the implication is that you created, right? This is your fault, God. Adam says, well, God, I know what kind of trouble I'm in, but this is kind of you who did this. You're the one who made Eve. And Eve says, well, God, I don't know what I've done here, but this is kind of your fault. Didn't you make the serpent? And then we see when Cain murders his brother, God comes to Cain and he asks him about his brother. And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? God, this is kind of your fault. You're the one that gave me a brother. You knew this sort of thing would exist. And here is Sarai with this kind of visceral attitude coming out of her heart, right? That the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. That's what gives me justification to go against his original plan for marriage. That's what gives me justification for perpetrating this against Hagar. That's not her desire necessarily. That's what gives me justification for behaving the way I am. That it's slander against God. By the way, this puts sin in a much worse light, right? when it shows someone saying to God, look, this is your fault. I'm going to do something wrong. I'm going to do something that breaks your laws. And the reason I'm doing actually is because you didn't make things right. You created this world wrong. You put me in a situation that I can't stand. You stacked the deck against me. It's a reminder that our problems are actually rooted in a faithlessness, that we don't want to do naturally what Abram was credited for doing in the last chapter, that he believed God and God counted it to him as righteousness. Now, in this story, Sarai's plan is both successful and unsuccessful, right? It's successful in the sense that Hagar does conceive a child by Abram. That Sarai's plan was literally that Hagar will have this child and she'll place the child on my knees. That this child will be given to me because I own her. This will be my child under my name. In that sense, it's successful. Hagar does conceive. But in another sense, it's unsuccessful because this only makes things worse for Sarai and Abram. And Sarai has this emotional turn here, even though the plan is of her making, and it's very telling. I want you to notice what faithless living does for you. Number one, it leaves Sarai feeling wounded. When Hagar saw that she was carrying the child that Sarai assumed was promised to her, Hagar, it says, looked on Sarai with contempt. And this changed the relationship between Hagar and Sarai, of course, which, by the way, if you're reading that and you're shocked at that, then you have a little comprehension problem. Like, none of us should be shocked. No one is shocked about that. Sarai shouldn't be shocked about it. Abram shouldn't be shocked about it. Hagar certainly wasn't shocked about this. Anybody who thinks that this sort of corruption of marriage isn't going to cause a problem, I don't know where you've been looking, but it's every time. So there shouldn't be any surprise, but it is the surprise to us that Sarai's surprised, isn't it? I think we should be. This is one of those, when you're reading the Bible, I'm a little shocked that Sarai's reaction is this strong, and you're supposed to be. You're supposed to ride that concern. Why is, and maybe this is the husband in me speaking, some of you wives are going to have to tell me, why I'm wondering, why is she upset when this was her idea, right? And I'm not saying I don't understand that now. I'm just saying we're supposed to be confronted with this. Why does this make any sense? The last thing I heard, Sarai said, this is a great plan. It's going to work. It's going to make us happy. The next thing we find out, Sarai says, this is a terrible plan. It's all your fault. This ruined my life. And we're trying to figure out what was the surprise here? Did she really not know that was going to happen? What's this emotional roller coaster that she's on? She says actually to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. And really the wrong there is a sense of cruelty. She feels like she has been treated cruelly. Now there's some irony here in what she does to Hagar. And we're not excusing Sarai at all, but when in Celebrate Recovery sometimes we say that hurt people, and there's truth to that what Sarai does to Hagar is an expression that she's genuinely hurt. She says to Abram, you've wounded me. This has been cruel to me. And she's not making that up. That isn't a persecution complex on her part. She's saying that this sinful choice of ours has cut me to the core in a way maybe that she didn't really know that it would. And we have to ask ourselves, why is Sarai so hurt? Again, if you want to play the emotionally clueless husband, you would say, well, this was your idea, right? I thought you came up with this. Why are you so hurt if you thought it was your idea? And yet Sarai is saying, look, I'm viewed with contempt by Hagar. I think we should also add, and again, this you can bank on, this is always true. She's wounded because the bond of marriage was broken. When Jesus talked about marriage and he said that the two shall become one flesh and no man should separate them, he was saying that this kind of pain will always accompany this kind of sin. Always. There's no way around it. Even if it was Sarai's idea, she then realizes, oh, that was far more painful than I could conceive of. Moreover, she felt in a way like she was punished by God and Abram and Hagar. When she says to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you, this is Sarai saying, everybody's taking it out on me. I'm the brunt of this. Now, we could say, well, you're just being overly emotional. But I'm telling you that this is a result of faithless living. that the feeling of woundedness, and saying that I've been cut to the core. This has hit me about who I really am. I've been wronged. And that's a very real feeling for Sarai. Not only that, she goes from feeling wounded to feeling worthless. The Bible says that Hagar looked on Sarai with contempt. 2 times it tells us that. Verses 4, it says that she did it. Verse 5, Sarai herself says, Hagar has looked on me with contempt. And that idea of contempt may not be a word that we use a lot today, but in the original language, it's the sense of lightness. And it really is that Hagar was making Sarai feel worthless. That's what she's saying. That the way Hagar looks at me makes me feel like I'm nothing, like I have no value. It's hitting at her worth in life. And again, we can ask ourselves, well, why does Sarai feel that contempt so acutely? If we're trying to follow Sarai, how can you go from, hey, this is a great plan, this is going to work out wonderfully, to this makes me feel worthless? Well, maybe that's part of the reason. It was her plan. And it comes with some additional regret. You know, sin earns you compound interest way better than your bank account does. And that's one of the ways it does so, that once you've chosen that path, then Satan comes, and he is, as the accuser of the brethren, he not only says to you, oh, look at the consequences that you're going to reap now, but then he says to you, and it was your stupid plan. And he says to you, and you're just the sort of loser that always chooses these things. You're so dumb, this is the way you always act. You've been this way since you were a kid, right? All these things. And here Sarai is having this poured on her. This was my plan. I thought this would work. And here I am feeling lighter and lighter, worthless. I have no value. In fact, maybe most importantly, if you think about her connection to the promises that have been made to Abram at this point, she was probably starting to feel like, I'm outside of the promise. I thought that this would be my guarantee in, right? That God is going to give Abram and I a son who's going to be part of the salvation plan for all humanity. God prevented me from having children, but this is how I'm going to horn my way anyway. And as soon as she sees the look on Hagar's face, when Hagar knows that she's become with child, then Sarai knows, am I out then? I have no value to this. I wasn't even necessary to this. The plan of salvation has just skipped right over me. This is a deep sense of worthlessness. And finally, it leaves her crying out for vindication of some sorts. And again, all of this for Sarai is addressed at Abram, but of course, in some ways, it's reflecting on God himself. And she calls the Lord to come and judge for her. One of the things, and I'm transparent about this, one of the things I'm doing as I'm studying this passage is I'm looking for that capital L-O-R-D in every story of Abram, just because that's part of my study through this time. It's kind of one of the things I'm trying to dig out this time as I study through. And if you look in this chapter, every time that word Lord is used, it's Sarai at the beginning, and she's the one calling out to God. And it's almost shocking then when you start realizing that she has concocted this plan. She's blamed God for it. Now she's upset with it. And when she's upset, she calls God to come and judge things. Isn't that a little shocking? She immediately says, God, why don't you come and judge between me and Abram? Look what he's done to me. Have you ever considered where these feelings come from? This sense of woundedness, this sense of worthlessness, this sense of a need for justice, crying out, where is God? Why doesn't he make things right? Why doesn't he vindicate me? In fact, let's just think personally for a minute as we're talking about this. I don't want to rush through this. These are very real feelings. People, maybe you're here today saying, I know exactly what Sarai is going through. Not in her context of being a part of the salvation history of humankind, but I certainly know what it's like for my own sinful choices and those around me to leave me at a place where I'm feeling wounded and worthless, and I've been crying out to God for some sort of justice, for some sort of vindication. All of these things are the products of faithless living. And it's a painful reminder, but it's a vivid one as we compare Genesis 15 and Genesis 16, and we see that the choice is for Abram to believe God and God counted him as righteousness, or to live in a faithless society, a faithless sense of community with faithless decisions, and what we get is feeling wounded, feeling worthless, feeling this need for justice, for God to act. Abram was wrong for consenting to the plan. Sarai is not completely false in her accusation against Abram. As the leader of the family, he bears a responsibility for this. Sarai was wrong for suggesting it, absolutely. She was very clear that she's the one accusing God. He doesn't know what he's doing here. And everyone involved suffered for it. But these feelings are not inherent to you. And this is something I want to make clear this morning. This is actually helpful for us to realize. If you have these feelings, you say, I feel wounded. I've been walking around in my heart saying, when is God going to act? When is he going to stand up for me? Or I feel worthless. I feel like I've been this way since the day I was born. I have no value. That feeling is not a result of your personal defectiveness. So let me just disabuse you of that. If you're saying, I feel that way and no one else here does, let me just tell you that that's not the case. I can't give you the news that no one feels that way, but maybe the next best thing is just tell you that actually everyone has felt that way. And it's not a result of because you're particularly defective that you feel that way. It's actually a result because we live in a faithless world. And you and I and everyone around you have made faithless living decisions. And in this sense, Sarai was not wrong to call on God for him to be the solution. Now we're going to take kind of a dramatic turn here. This is where the story has what should be a surprising turn. Hagar at this point is the tragic figure. And in Abram's day, Sarai had the ability to do whatever she wanted to Hagar. I'm not saying it would have been morally right, but legally she had the ability to do whatever she wanted. Abram had the ability to do whatever he wanted. She has the least real choice of participation in the story, even though Sarai is the most vocal about her suffering. It's Hagar who bears the brunt of the consequences. But here's where the story takes this turn, and we're seeing that the story isn't about Abram only, it's about God. And that is in the fact that God cares for Hagar. Now, if you're a believer here this morning and you've been reading the New Testament, you've come to have a relationship with Jesus, I hope that there's some of you that say, well, that's not a surprise to me. I know who God is. But in the revelation of the Old Testament, this is supposed to be a very key feature. It's a time to show you that this is who God is, that this kind of care, this faithfulness flows out of God's nature, that this is the kind of God that he is. Again, compare Genesis chapter 15, Genesis 16. Genesis chapter 15, God and Abram make an official covenant. Remember, Abram takes the sacrificial animals, he splits them in half, he makes a path between the two bloody halves, and in his day, kings would have walked together through that sacrifice, saying, we now agree to this commitment to each other, and if we don't keep it, may we be like these animals who've been divided in half. Two things happened that are kind of different in Abram's circumstances. Abram's asleep, and God walks through that place himself. And in the very next chapter, Abram doesn't keep his end of the covenant. Abram doesn't keep his bargain. It's a good thing he didn't walk through those animals, isn't it? Because if he had, he wouldn't have made it just days later. It would have been immediately, God would have had to say, Abram, you didn't keep your end of the covenant. But the whole point is to show that it's God who's faithful. It's part of his nature. This is one of the clear reminders that this story is more about God than about Abram. That Abram abandoned his leadership role. He allowed Sarai to abuse Hagar. So Hagar fled into the wilderness. She was probably on her way back to Egypt. That's the route that she's going, at least. She's stopped by this spring on the way to Shur. And there she meets the angel of the Lord. And there's some difficulty here in interpretation. There's some debate on this appearance about whether this was an angel, what we would call an angel, a messenger today, or whether it was an appearance of God himself, and they're using the term angel kind of as a representative for God himself. I don't know that we're going to settle that this morning, but I do want to make this very clear. And this is actually my opinion. I do believe that this was a messenger mediating between God and Hagar. But if I can describe this mental picture to you, this is one of those cases where the angel was an open conduit. In other words, the difficulty in interpretation is that Hagar addresses the angel exactly as if she were addressing God directly. And so personally, and I think this is maybe a solution to that in this sense, the angel was almost literally a megaphone. Like he's essentially a path of communication between God and Hagar. That Hagar can speak to the angel as if she's communicating directly to God, and the angel will give that message verbatim as Hagar gave it to him. And God can speak to Hagar just as directly as he were speaking to her in person. The angel is delivering that message verbatim just as God would give it. So we can say in a very real sense that Hagar has a meeting with the Lord. It is an angel, I believe, and I think that's an accurate description, but it is a meeting that is bringing God's very words and commitments to her and transmitting Hagar's very words back to God. And God commands Hagar to return to Sarai. This is a difficult command, isn't it? Some of you might be saying, man, that's a hard thing to say. Because we can assume, and assume correctly, that what Sarai was doing to Hagar was vicious. It was cruel. She was taking out the hurt that she was feeling, and she was bringing it out to Hagar. And legally, not morally, but legally, she had the right to carry out whatever she wanted. She was abusing her. Hagar is someone who's been clearly abused. But let me point out that God is making it clear that if Hagar returns, he will protect her. And in fact, when she does return, Abram finally, to lack of a better term, he mans up. That this is Abram's responsibility. He's the father of the child. And he can say, well, this is my wife's suggestion, but it is his child, and it's his job both to protect the child and that child's mother. And in whatever way in that relationship they have to come about it, Abram does it. When Hagar comes back, we see that Abram is a defender for Hagar and for Ishmael. We find this out later in Genesis when Ishmael is about 13 years old. We see that Abram has been taking care of him. He's taken him as a son. He recognizes him as a son. And certainly Abram is being challenged by God, even as God's delivering this message to Hagar, that he's going to have to take full responsibility. But also, and this is what is fascinating, it's supposed to be surprising that Hagar will also be blessed with part of the blessing of Abram's household. That God comes and says to Hagar, you're going to have a son, and you're going to be the progenitor of many descendants. That's the same kind of promise that God made to Abram. That Hagar is going to find God to be faithful to her in some of the same way that God has been proving himself to be faithful to Abram all along. Now, I want to try to get a kind of a fine point on this just for a moment, that the Bible is clear, especially in the New Testament, that the redemption plan of God flowed through Isaac and not through Ishmael. And there's even some very important spiritual application of that in Galatians chapter 4. So I don't want you to hear me saying that that's somewhat in doubt at this point. That's not in doubt at this point. But here we see that God extends his faithfulness even to Hagar, and I want to make it clear that it is simply because of who he is. In other words, this is God saying, over and above the covenant I have with Abram, over and above any of the circumstances of this pregnancy, I am showing my faithfulness, and I am extending part of the promise that I've given to Abram to his son, even if the son is in this sense illegitimate. He's not the son of promise. He's not the son that I had committed to give to Abram, but he will receive this part of the promise. And Hagar says two things about God in relation to this. And Hagar's not a prophetess. She doesn't have this special revelation in the sense that these things can't be known by others, but this is an expression of her realization that this is who God is. First of all, she calls God the God who sees. This is actually one of the names that we can find for God in the Old Testament. This is the name El Roi. That is the God who sees. And when Hagar expresses it in her own terms, she says, "You are the God of seeing," or the God who sees, El Roi. You are him who looks after me, right? So this is not just the God who sees in his omniscience, that God knows all things, he can see all things, but she's saying, no, that you see and you care. That is an essential part of who God is. Now, we don't know Hagar's whole history. We don't know what it was like for her in Egypt. We do know that the time later when the people of Israel are dwelling in Egypt, some years after this, that they're a fully idolatrous people. We can make an assumption that there's idolatry going on in Egypt. So we don't know all of Hagar's past. But let me just posit that Hagar is making a distinction between any other god she has known. She's been living in the household of Abram and Sarai for some years. She's recognized that they worship this God who's made a promise to them. And here she's saying, this is the God of Abram, this is the Lord, and he's the God who sees. None of the other gods that I've been aware of, none of the other gods maybe that she's even worshipped, see and care for her. By the way, this is a fascinating testimony for many people who have come out of some other religious view or some other system of belief and come to Christ. And I love it when I hear this testimony for them to say, one day I realized that the gods I worshipped or the things I served didn't care anything for me. But the God of the Bible, the Father of Jesus, he cares for me. And that's what Hagar's saying, that I've met a God who sees me and he cares for me. We almost take an interruption in the story of Abram just to know that this is important for you to understand about who God is. This is in some ways separate from conversation about the covenant that God's making with Abram. Again, there's something very profound to be talked about the fact that Ishmael is not the child of promise, that the son of promise is still coming, and the New Testament draws all the spiritual lessons that we're going to take out of that when we come to that chapter. But in this case, we're just seeing that Hagar's correct, that God is faithful in his very nature. He didn't just choose to be faithful in a particular way to Abram, but he is faithful in himself. He's the God who sees and cares for Hagar. And secondly, in a roundabout way, she says of God that he is the God who hears. God says to her that she will name the child Ishmael. And indeed, at the end of the chapter, we see that that's exactly what she does. She names him Ishmael. And Ishmael means heard of God. That, in a sense, God is saying to her that he heard her pain. Now, the Bible doesn't play out this alternative scenario here, but let me just tell you that if Hagar had not conceived a child and Sarah had gone through with her plan, do you think that everything would have been just fine then? No. In fact, Hagar would have been in more danger. Sarai would have treated her just as badly, and she would have nothing to recommend her to Abram. Now, again, I'm going to interpolate here a little bit, but wouldn't you imagine that the cry of Hagar, who in many ways is the victim in this whole story, she's the one who has the least choice of participating in this plan, that her prayer was, God, vindicate me. This is putting me in a position, this is putting me at a risk, this is doing something to me that I have very little control over. And when God names her son Ishmael, God is saying, I heard you. I'm the God who listens. I heard that cry of yours. And again, we're taking in some ways an interruption, a break from God's work in Abram's life, from God's work of the covenant, what he's doing in salvation history. We're talking just about Hagar, and Hagar is realizing, this is the God who sees me, he looks after me, this is the God who hears me. God has some special promises for this child Ishmael. They're not all roses. I don't know that you would want your child at the baby shower to somebody write on a little, maybe crochet on a little towel. He will be a wild donkey of a man. Not really what you look forward to at the baby shower. But for Hagar, this is not necessarily as negative as you may think. Again, she's wanting to know, will this child live? Remember, she's fleeing for her life. And God is saying to her, your son's going to be a survivor. And that is what the Ishmaelites become. He says they're going to be a warlike people. They're going to dwell over against their kinsmen. There's going to be many descendants. And although there is some difficult things in that promise, Hagar is certainly taking it as God's promising this child will not only be born, this child will live, this child will have a sense of success. He'll father a people. There'll be a warlike and powerful people. There's all kinds of promises that God is giving to Hagar in that. And Hagar recognizes, this is the God who hears me. And in fact, the end of this chapter says that this son was born to Abram. And in the New Testament, it calls Ishmael the son of Abram in the flesh. That he is the son of Abram in that sense. An inheritor of that part of the promise, that his descendants will be many. This morning, I wanted to do something a little differently as we close. I actually want to share a video with you, and then we're going to pray together, sing a song together as we close. This video is actually one that that I saw when I was at a Warrior Leadership Summit some years ago. Many of you are familiar with their work. They also have a band and a music group called Warrior Worship that produces their music for their camp every year. And they produce some really good music videos. And this is a video that goes with this passage of Scripture. This morning, as we come to a close, I just want to give you an opportunity. We look at a story like this, we see a lot of the pain and the difficulty that are in that story, and maybe you recognize some of that, whether it's in Sarai's reaction of feeling wounded, of feeling worthless, crying out for vindication, whether it's in Hagar, the one who is abused, but we have a God who sees and a God who hears. As we close this morning, maybe God is letting you know that He's the one who sees what you're going through.